Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us at the Financial Planning Institute of Southern Africa. This afternoon, we have got one of our certified financial planners, Mr. Gareth Collier. He is also part of our FBI Financial Planning Practice of the Year. That is Crew Invest that won the prize at the end of last year. Gareth, thank you so much for your time. I think we have had a conversation about the two-pot system and how it's going to affect not just the industry, but our financial advisors and financial planners going forward. So we can't wait to hear what value you can add to the students' knowledge this afternoon. So please go ahead. Just some housekeeping rules. You are welcome to raise your hand, ask questions. We want this to be an interactive session, so please take part if you need to. Thank you, Gareth.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nikki, and welcome to everybody. Thank you for taking the time this afternoon to join us. I've got some slides for us to have a look at, but really, as much as this is an information session and maybe a bit of a feedback, let's try and keep it nice and interactive. I find that the best learnings comes from questions, and I hope you guys know, like, generally speaking, if you sort of have a question and maybe you're a bit concerned about asking it, I promise you now maybe 80% of the other people are thinking the same thing. So let's try not be shy. Let's ask any question that you might think of, and hopefully maybe learn together this afternoon. So I'm going to just kick off the slideshow here. Nikki, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
It is still blank on my side. Fatima, can you see it?
Blank, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, let's just give it a minute.
Sorry. Worked fine a minute ago.
Yeah.
Sorry, everyone.
No problem.
Technical struggles.
No problem. Maybe just unshare and share again. That sometimes solves the problem.
Okay, let's try this.
There we go. Perfect. Can just
You
go
got
to
it.
slideshow. Yes.
There we go. Okay, does that look a bit better?
Yes, 100%.
Okay, lovely. So this afternoon, we're going to focus, as Nikki said, on this sort of proposed two-pot system for retirement funds in South Africa. And really, the theme is trying to say, like, are we trying to balance retirement outcomes with maybe a bit of a lifeline for emergencies along the way? So in terms of an agenda, what I'd like to cover today is just have a look at a bit of an introduction around two-pot, sort of why have a two-pot system, where does it come from, what are the desired outcomes. Then obviously it makes sense to cover the legislation that's going to be implemented provisionally in September this year, what will be implemented, and then how is this actually going to come about and in effect. Then we're going to have a look at two sort of very simple examples. So maybe somebody who's potentially going to be a newer retirement fund member, how is this going to impact them? And then also somebody who's a bit of an older retirement member, maybe closer to retirement. And then really I'd like to kind of close off with a bit of a discussion point. A lot of the time we look at the legislation and we do the calculations, but really if you're going into an advisory space, how do you actually have these conversations with clients, with people, not only just to explain the technicalities and how it's going to work and what the tax is, but what sort of conversations could you be having with them in terms of how does two-pot impact their lives? So looking at it from an introduction perspective, where does the approach actually come from? Well, some of it initially was to say, fine, how do we introduce a system that's going to sort of better address the retirement funding in South Africa? I think it's a very well-established statistic, and it's remained pretty consistent for many, many years now, that only about 6% of South Africans can afford to retire, which means that they have enough money to actually go into retirement, but then also stay retired. They have sufficient sort of investments and capital and assets to sustain their lifestyle. So what happened is, before COVID was even a thing, and the whole world had a pandemic and we went into lockdowns, initially the system was born out of a forced preservation idea. So the idea was that if people had to move employers, they wanted to take away any access to your retirement funds pre-retirement. So whether you move employers, taking a withdrawal, if you put money into a preservation fund at the time of moving to a new employer, that you would no longer have access to that preservation fund pre-retirement. That was sort of the initial line of thinking. Then the COVID pandemic hit, and I think everybody realized that you cannot sort of unilaterally just lock away all those finances until retirement, because there might be these dramatic unforeseen events that we simply cannot expect or plan for. And thus, how do we land up funding for those? There's no point really somebody having a large pot of retirement money on one side where they've got no access to it, and their only choice for funding is now to go get expensive personal loans, revolving credit, maybe borrowing from family. So so really that was possibly an unintended consequence of having that well-intentioned approach in terms of funding for retirement. So the two-part thinking was thinking, well, how do we find a balance between those two? How do we balance making sure that we are saving and investing for the long term so we can be self-sustaining in retirement, but in the same breath also making sure that there is a little bit of a lifeline if these emergencies do crop up? So looking at the legislation, and currently it was announced at the budget speech that 1 September later this year is the intended implementation of the two-pot legislation. We're still waiting for exact ratification on that, so there might still be slight amendments to these legislation rules, but it's going to split our funds into two pots or two components, okay? But the first thing we've got to look at is this, okay, fine, what actually happens on the day that this is implemented? And if we look here, so I don't know if my point is there. So if we look at all the retirement savings that you've accumulated before or up until the end of August this year, the administrator, okay, so whether that's a pension fund, a provident fund, whether you've got a retirement annuity, whoever that administrator is going to have to take a once-off compulsory transfer of either 10%, okay, of the retirement savings or 30,000 Rand, so whichever's lower, okay? And the balance of, so that portion is going to be used as seed money for the so-called savings pot that's going to be introduced. The balance of the funds after that deduction is going to be put into a vested pot, okay? That money will stay vested, which simply means that it holds all of its rights that it currently experiences now, depending on the nature of the product. And you then have the option as the investor, to stay as a paid up member in that fund, wherever it may be. You could, or this is also if you're leaving an employer, sorry. So you could stay as a deferred member or a paid up member, no problem there. That portion, the vested portion, you could still take in cash, it's still accessible. Or you could follow the old pattern and just transfer that money over to a new retirement fund. Maybe the new employer's also got a pension fund that you simply want to join, but you will carry those vested rights with you. Then everything from the 1st of September onwards is going to be treated under this two-pot system. So what's going to happen is the retirement contributions will be split into two components. 1/3 of those contributions is going to go into the savings component or the savings pot. So it's going to have received that initial seed capital transfer from your existing fund, plus 1/3 of all future contributions is going into the savings pot. The other 2/3 is going to go into the retirement pot, okay? And the key differences between the two is the savings component is you're going to have the ability to access and withdraw from that money before you retire, okay? Small little rules at the moment. Currently, during the tax year, you may only make one withdrawal throughout the tax year, and it needs to be a minimum of 2,000 Rand, okay? The retirement component, all right, that is going to become fully inaccessible until retirement. The only time that you're really going to see those funds is if you pass away, when it goes to your beneficiaries, or if you become permanently disabled. So even if you move employers, whatever the case may be, that money you cannot touch now until we get to retirement age. Okay, so it's always best and easiest just to look at some practical examples. So looking at an example of this split at inception, so this person has 150,000 Rand in retirement savings at the end of August, and their monthly net contribution to their pension fund is 900 Rand. So very simply, the vested component, that is going to receive of the 150, they're going to take 10% as the lower of the 15,000 or the 30. That is going to go to the savings component, and the balance, the 135, will go into the vested component of the pension fund in this example. No further contributions are going to go into that vested component. All growth is obviously still going to happen in there. It's still invested as it was before, simply going to sit there with all the vested rights that you previously had. Then on the other side, so from September onwards, of your 900 Rand contribution, 300 Rand is going to start going towards the savings component as 1/3 of that, whilst the 600 Rand 2/3 balance is going to go to the retirement contribution. Okay. All right, as I mentioned earlier, there is this seeding limit in terms of what can be transferred, and it is a one-time transfer at inception of this two-pot system. It's not going to be repeated again every year. The vested component, if the previous example, somebody had accumulated 150,000, where in this example, somebody's accumulated 500,000 in savings. Very simply, they're going to say, well, 10% of the 500 is 50, but because it's higher than the 30,000 limit, only the 30,000 is going to go into the savings component, a seeding capital, and the balance of 470 is then going to remain in the vested pot.
Gareth, there is a hand up.
Yes. Sorry, I can't see.
Okay, that's fine. Tandu, can you unmute yourself and you can ask your question? Oh dear, wait, give it a second. Allow Mike. Sure. Please try again. Tandu, there we go.
Yep. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Ahmed, sorry, man, for interjection. I just wanted to find out, with this vested pot, the vested pot, you said you can take in cash. Can you take everything in cash on the 1st of September 2024? Let's assume you had 1 million Rand. Then you take 30,000 Rands. You left with 970. Can you take all of that?
So the only way you'd have access to that, so remember that's got the vested rights. So if you were in a retirement annuity, then no, because remember you've got no access to that before retirement age. If you're in a company pension or provident fund, yes, you could, but the only way to do that would be to resign. Like you would have to have before, you would have to resign. So you're breaking your membership with the fund. You then retain the right on the vested component, as you do right now, to take those funds in cash subject to tax.
Oh, okay. So it means still that the same rules would apply, the same rules that you normally use. Like if you don't have what you call this now, provident funds anymore, but if you want to take your money, you'd have to resign from the fund as it used to happen.
Correct. Yeah. So that's what the vested term means. It just means that simply all the rights that currently prevail on those funds are vested, so they stay with that pot of cash or that component right the way through. You keep all the access rules that you have right now along the way. So yes, even if the split happened and only 2 years later you happen to resign from the employer, if you think about it practically, you could then choose to withdraw your vested component, your vested pot in cash, plus the savings component, all right? But the retirement component you wouldn't be able to attach.
Oh no, thank you very much. I needed that clarity because I had a client who was of the belief that they'll be able to take everything without any penalties or whatever, without any repercussions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm glad they were of that belief. I think it's more of a hope. Okay.
Thank you, man.
All right. Pleasure. Okay. No, why can't I? Oh, there we go. Okay, so I think this answers exactly what we were talking to now. So the vested component, the options that you've got, well, in terms of withdrawal, again, if you leave your employer, so anytime between now and retirement, those options are still going to remain for your vested pot, your vested component. Okay, so if you resign, if you're dismissed, if you're retrenched, you've still got all those access rights. when you hit retirement, the access to that cash is going to depend on like where it's come from originally. So you mentioned earlier, we don't really have provident funds anymore, but there might be people who had provident funds previously. So at retirement, they can still take 100% of that cash. The people who are in pension funds that go through this fund split, they're only going to have access to 1/3 of their vested component, and the other 2/3 will go into an annuity, as it has been right up until today where we stand. Those retirement accesses are still going to be taxed on the retirement tax table, and any withdrawals that you make on this side pre-retirement still going to be taxed on the withdrawal table pre-retirement. Okay. So looking firstly at the savings component, so like we've said, 1/3 of the contributions is going to be going into the savings component. And this is then going to become the only cash eventually, once people have been through the system and a lot of the vested components, people have sort of aged out and retired from them. In future, you'll only have a savings and retirement component, regardless of whether you were in a pension fund or retirement annuity. The savings component is going to become the only money that you can choose to, or you can opt to take as a lump sum at retirement. Okay, so if you imagine if you've gone along over the years and you frequently access the savings component, what you're doing is you're just eroding away a lot of your access to cash at retirement. Okay. So just coming back to the access point. So I think I jumped ahead of myself. So at retirement, you can take the entirety of the savings component at retirement, because if you think about it, it's received 1/3 of all the contributions. That's going to be the 1/3, 2/3 split as we have it now. So whatever you take from it is going to be subject to the normal retirement tax tables. So currently the first 500 tax-free, unless you've made previous withdrawals. As I said, you're only allowed to access this fund once a year. Okay, so people need to be very aware. They get overexcited in the March or the April of the tax year and they access some money. Unfortunately, you are not going to be able to help them again right through the year until the next tax year. That withdrawal request is simply going to be denied. Okay. Currently, the minimum withdrawal is 2,000 Rand, but there's no explicit upper end of the withdrawal at the moment. Very importantly, any withdrawals that you make are going to be taxed on your marginal income tax rate. Okay, and that is going to be the rate that you currently pay. Okay, maybe one of the good things, like we've touched on before, is that you don't now have to go and resign from your job to access at least some of your retirement money if you do land up in a bit of a financial bind. Okay, so in the past, where people would struggle financially and maybe resign to access their retirement funds to get themselves out of debt, which is great in the short term maybe, and they sleep a bit better at night, but now they land up in a situation where possibly they can't easily find employment again. Okay, so really what you want to think about is that you want to be very careful when making withdrawals from this savings component to make sure they're genuine financial emergencies and you don't really have too many other options. Okay, switching focus now to the retirement component. As we've said earlier, 2/3 of your monthly contributions is now going to be directed to the retirement component, but no withdrawals are going to be accessible from this retirement component pre-retirement. Okay, other than death and disability, the money is going to be completely inaccessible. And when you do get to retirement one day, unlike right now where you've got access to some of your lump sum, the savings component is going to be your only lump sum, and all the monies that are sitting in the retirement component must be used to purchase an annuity. So either a life or a living annuity or a combination of the two. Okay, so just to recap, in terms of the retirement component, withdrawals, if you leave your employer, whether you is a resignation, a dismissal, even a retrenchment, you cannot access any of that money in cash, okay? And you're forced to do a preservation fund of some sort. So either in-fund preservation if you're leaving a company fund, or a transfer to a personal preservation fund, or even a retirement annuity, because these rules are going to work pretty much the same. You can also then transfer that retirement component to another another fund. Okay. At retirement, like I mentioned, you must use all of the money, okay, to buy a pension, and none of it is going to be available in cash, right? The only time that's going to be currently under the rules is if that the 2/3 vested component is less than 165,000 as a lump sum. That's going to be the only instance that you can request to take all the money as a cash payment. Okay, Nikki, will you just shout if there's any questions?
Yes, there are some questions in the chat, but we will deal with them afterwards, I think.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so that's looking at some of the technicalities and the legislations. So let's just have a look at some simple examples. So here we've got our newer fund member. Thandi is 29 years old. So how is the two-pot system going to impact her? She's never had any previous retirement funds. So she's now finished her studies, she's finished some travel, she's gone off and she started to work, and she just so happens to join her retirement fund on the 1st of September 24. So as the system is implemented, so her contributions are immediately going to be subject to the two-pot structure. Okay. 8 years later, she has around about 200,000 Rand in the savings component, and she's got this crippling debt, right? So maybe some of the pros that we can think about is that in this circumstance, yes, some funds are accessible if needed, okay? And she no longer needs to go through the sort of trauma of having to decide whether she resigns from her employer to access these funds to get her out of that that sort of debt spiral that she's found herself in the short term. Maybe on the downside, like we mentioned earlier, that any withdrawal she makes is taxable at her marginal tax rate. So if you think about it, if she's gone from being a relatively new employee, 8 years later, she's had a few promotions, a few salary increases, she's maybe slid up the tax tables a little bit. So perhaps when she started working, her contributions to the retirement fund, maybe she was getting a marginal deduction of around 18%, and perhaps now she's now earning at a level that she's paying a marginal rate of 36%. So she's gotten a tax break on those contributions at 18%, but now she's going to be taxed at 36% when drawing money out. Okay, something to be aware of. And of course, any withdrawals that she does make, we're going to have to discuss with her the long-term impact that's going to have on her accessibility to cash at retirement, which is an important question because we've got to think about liquidity in retirement as well. So, again, I've jumped ahead of myself. So maybe some of the considerations, if we were planners sitting across from this client, we say to her, okay, fine, well, maybe yes, we possibly are going to pay a bit more tax now than when you made your contributions, but let's also look at what is that marginal tax against the interest that you're paying on this debt. Does it make mathematical sense to do it? Okay. Whatever the reasoning for the debt, is this a genuine financial emergency? Is it something that really needs to go through to the extreme? Are there no other options than simply drawing from your retirement pot? As I mentioned, how's this going to affect your long-term planning? And are there any alternative options? And sometimes it doesn't mean going out and finding financing. Perhaps maybe if she's not in a company retirement fund, maybe this is a personal retirement annuity. Well, maybe the consideration is to say to her, well, hang on, why don't we stop your retirement annuity contributions for a period of time and address your debt, because we can always pick that up again at a later stage, rather than drawing out and paying the tax. Just get a little bit more sort of intuitive and creative with the options. Okay. So we fast forward now. Thandi is now 65, and we've got to look at, well, what is her access at retirement? So through the rest of her career, she's worked really, really diligently. She's had a great success, and now she's ready to retire. Since our first interaction, she's been a very consistent saver, but she's had several instances across the years where she needed to access her savings component. Okay. So, she made the decision when we first looked at her now to draw that 200,000 Rand to settle off some debt. A few years later, she drew another lump sum, a couple of years later after that, and then again at the age of 59. Okay. So her retirement, her retirement pot is now got a savings component of 800,000 Rand and a retirement component of 6 million Rand. So if we decide, okay, well, what are her options? She'd like all the available cash that she can get a hold of. She feels like she's worked really hard. She'd like to travel and enjoy herself. So really, she's worried about, doing this while she's still relatively fit and healthy. So what access does she have? Well, what is the impact of her previous withdrawals on the access to retirement lump sum? We've got to think about that. Well, none, because at the time of making those withdrawals, she's paid the marginal tax rate for making those withdrawals, right? So it's not really going to have much an impact on the accessible retirement lump sum because what's there is available. Okay. What can she access at retirement? Well, because she's only ever sat under the two-pot system, she will only have the accumulated savings component that is accessible as cash. She's not going to have anything else that's possibly available to access. The savings component, which is going to be the only accessible amount, is fully accessible. So you can take 100% of that in cash, but it is going to be taxed on the retirement tax table because now it's a retirement from the fund rather than a withdrawal from the fund. Okay. And then the retirement component, well, that can only be used to create an annuity for income. Okay. So she's got a couple of options there, but unfortunately, cash is not one of them. Okay, switching focus a little bit, if we look at an older member now, so we've got Derek, who's 53 years old. How's two-pot now going to impact him? He's possibly nearing retirement with some savings. So he's a current member of his pension fund. So on the 24th of September, his active fund that he's already contributing is going to be subject to the two-pot reallocation. Okay. So at the end of August, he's already accumulated 3 million in his company pension fund. He's got 400,000 Rand in a provident preservation fund. He's got another 1 million Rand in a pension preservation fund. So when the two-pot system is applied in September, how is this going to affect his various funds? So the company retirement fund, well, they're going to now have to create these pots that we mentioned earlier. So firstly, they're going to look at the savings pot and they're going to say, well, it's the lesser of 10% of the fund or 30,000 Rand. So with it being a 3 million Rand pension fund, 300,000 is obviously a lot more of 10% than the 30,000. So what they're going to do is they're going to put 30,000 Rand into the savings pot plus 1/3 of all future contributions to the pension fund. The vested pot, which is the money that he'd accumulated up until the end of August, well, that's simply going to be the 3 million Rand less the 30,000 seed capital for the savings pot. So the balance of the 2.97 million is going to move across to the vested pot, stay invested, simply grow alongside his other contributions until he retires one day. And the retirement pot itself is obviously going to start with a zero balance because it doesn't receive any seeding capital or anything like that, but it is going to receive 2/3 of all future contributions to his fund. Then what happens to the preservation funds? Well, again, there's no impact there. The preservation funds, they retain all vested rights already because they are vested benefits. So those are simply going to stay as they are. So now we look at what accesses does Derek have when he's 65. Now he's ready to retire. And he'd also like to access as much cash as possible. So what are his options? What can he receive? Well, from the company retirement fund, his savings pot that he would have accumulated over the last few years is going to be 100% accessible. The vested pot, because it was a pension fund, only 1/3 is going to be accessible as a lump sum, as it is right now. The 2/3 is going to have to be annuitized. And then the retirement pot, there's going to be no lump sum access. That, together with the 2/3 from the vested pot, is going to have to be annuitized. Then what about the preservation funds? Well, on the Provident Preservation Fund, he's still going to have 100% access. Let's ignore T-Day and that sort of thing for now. Let's assume that happened all before there. So it's carried forward that 100% access till retirement if he chooses. And the pension preservation, once again, it's only going to be a 1/3 lump sum access as it is right now, with the 2/3 balance having to be annuitized. Okay, So lastly, thinking about some considerations specifically from a planning and advisory side. How is this new system really going to impact retirement funding? So I think the first big one we've got to think about is how is this going to affect trustees' investment decisions, particularly on employer pension and provident funds. They're going to have to balance approaching a investment strategy that's going to have to balance the need for long-term real growth in a retirement component, but also now you don't want your savings component simply sitting in cash because people we assume people are going to access it. Ideally, people are not going to access that money. They're still going to leave it for absolute emergency. So you want it invested appropriately, like your retirement component, so it can grow for real growth above inflation. But you're also going to have to overlay the consideration that you will have random accesses to that fund. Now, we know how markets move up and down. We cannot predict when's going to be a good time, when's going to be a bad time to make those withdrawals. So it's going to be a tricky decision-making process, and a lot of thought is going to have to be applied to it. And I think a lot of, particularly on your pension funds, a lot of member engagement is going to have to happen. A lot of feedback, a lot of advice, a lot of financial education to people to understand why they perhaps invested one way or another, the impact that accessing their savings fund is going to have, not just necessarily the direct impact in terms of paying a marginal tax rate, but perhaps depending on the investment strategy that's taken, they may be unwittingly drawing out of the market at a very, very bad time. Once again, if you go back to COVID and lockdowns a couple of years ago, that was a time people were desperate for cash, understandably so. It was unprecedented. Nobody really knew how long things were going to stay locked down for. People needed cash to live on. You fully understand that. But in the same breath, you also had about a 20-30% market drop in the space of 20 days, which would have also compounded the damage you could have done to your savings component had this been in place back then. However, to play devil's advocate, not all savings pot accesses are necessarily bad. Sometimes when you having discussions with clients, when you're giving advice, you really got to sort of open up and say, well, hang on, you want to draw this. We just go with the worst case scenario. People can't control their spending, they get into debt, etc., etc. What if somebody's got the opportunity to set up a side hustle or sideline business with a friend? Maybe they need some seed capital for that. Then we sit down and say, oh, okay, hang on, you're going to take a 20 or 30% or maybe a 40% knock in tax on your withdrawal. But, that little seed capital may land up generating a heck of a lot of more return for them from that type of business than possibly just not paying the tax. So from these discussions, it's more than just the calculations in terms of if you make this decision, you pay this much tax and this is how much less you have in retirement. I'm going to be able to kind of have those discussions with clients to be able to give advice because everybody's situations are different and unique. Yes, we should have the technical understanding of what the impact would be so that they can be made aware of the consequences so they can make an informed decision. But as much as we want to help them make an informed decision, you need to kind of work with them to help them create a situation where you can also give informed advice based on their set of circumstances. So, one of the really long-term benefits, I think, will be that over time, investors will have a much, much more uniform set of rules for retirement funds. They're going to be a lot easier to understand. If you guys look back in terms of the history, not that long ago, where we left the old system of retirement funding income and non-retirement funding income, we kind of harmonized that. A couple of years later, we've had T-Day where we've harmonized sort of provident and pension funds. Pension funds have kind of always operated very similarly to retirement funds. This is sort of the next step now where you should hopefully, be in a situation where you can pretty seamlessly move from a pension fund to a personal retirement annuity, possibly back into a pension fund if you go to another employer, where you don't have to create these hundreds of little preservation funds and RAs and this and that all over the place. Yes, you can still have multiple of them. That's not a problem. But, in terms of the understanding, the access, the rights, it's for consumers and clients, it's going to be a much, much easier to understand and hopefully from our side, a lot easier to plan for as well. And I suppose the last one I mentioned earlier was that liquidity in retirement. This is like a pretty personal thing, because I think one of the own goals that the legislators might make or have made is calling the savings pot, the savings component, using the word savings. You know, much like your tax-free savings accounts, if you call something a savings account, people are generally going to treat it like that. So if people go and sort of wipe out or severely deplete their savings pot pre-retirement, and they get to a stage where you're now about to retire, you know, if you've got very little access to withdrawing a lump sum of cash to maybe reinvest it in like a simple unit trust structure or something like that, and the bulk of your retirement funds is going to sit in a life or a living annuity, you don't give yourself a lot of flexibility in terms of access to cash. Now, yes, we would love to think that we can perfectly calculate exactly how life is going to go post-retirement. We work with people all the time. We know we model that in theory, but we understand that in reality, it's going to move all over the place. And we kind of have to be able to plan and stay flexible for unseen events. And that's where liquidity comes in. And I'll give you an example. You know, if you think about somebody who's got, let's say, R1 million in their living annuity, we know their maximum access is 17.5% a year. So the maximum they can draw is 175,000 Rand. But now what happens the moment their living expenses goes to 15,000 Rand a month or more? Now you sit with a situation where you've got somebody who needs 180,000 Rand to live on each year. They have more than that in their investment savings or their investment product, but they don't have access to it. So they land up with this liquidity problem. And that's the sort of shooting themselves in the foot that they might do through many, many little missteps along the way pre-retirement that's going to have a devastating effect long time in the future. And I think those are all my bullet points.
Thank you, Gareth. That was really interesting, and I agree with the comments that were made in the chat. It's clear to your slides are very clear. It's very easy to understand, so that was really helpful. I've got a few questions here. I'm going to ask Gareth to answer these questions, and then I want some hands up so we can carry on with the conversations, please. So let's start here. Does the savings component also have to be Regulation 28 compliant?
Yes, it does. Remember, it's still a retirement fund, so it's still subject to the Pension Fund Act, and therefore, yeah, Reg 28 will apply.
Okay, so it'll obviously apply over the entire fund, not just the one pot or the other. The entire thing will have to be Reg 28 compliant.
Correct.
So Naledi's asking, how will the two-pot impact preservation and annuity? So I'm guessing preservation funds and retirement annuity funds post 1 September 2024.
So remember, the nature of a preservation fund is that it retains its vested right from when it was created, right? So that's going to carry forward. So typical preservation fund, whether it's provident or pension, you will still have that one-time pre-retirement access, subject to the withdrawal tax table. And then depending on whether it was a pension provident fund, the accessibility at retirement is going to carry forward as it is now, all the way through till the person retiring. In terms of a retirement annuity, that is seen as an active sort of fund, so it doesn't necessarily have vested rights. So only the monies within the retirement annuity up until the end of August will carry forward their vested rights. Thereafter, even your RA is going to be subject to the two-pot system like we saw in the example.
Okay, then one last question and we'll go to the hands. So this is an interesting one. Do we know how the fund selections are going to work between the vested and the savings portions? For example, depending on the client, you might not want the same investment risk on the retirement portion versus the savings portion. So will you be able to move the funds accumulated within the savings portion back into the retirement portion? That's the second question. So the first one is on the difference between the fund investment funds. And the second one is, can you move between savings to retirement options or pots?
So look, I think the honest answer right now is we're still waiting for a lot of the legislation to be ratified and finalized. What we do know is the overarching sort of idea is that it must be Reg 28 compliant. But if you think about it, your retirement component is going to be the one that you want to have the most aggressive fund allocation, the longer term growth. So provided that is Reg 28 compliant, maybe you're going with an inflation plus 6 strategy on your retirement fund, on the retirement component, but maybe you decide that within the savings component, you want to be slightly more conservative. Maybe you only go with inflation plus 4 there. I would think that could apply. Much like you can do fund allocation right now within your retirement annuity. I think the complication is going to come particularly for the trustees of employer retirement funds, your umbrella funds, because they're making decisions on behalf of their members, and then also bearing in mind that depending on the complexity of the employer fund, not all of them have sort of freedom to pick and choose which funds you go into. Some of them only make default funds available, perhaps 1 or 2, but it's not unlike a retirement annuity on, say, a unit trust platform, which is nice and wide in terms of your fund selection. It can be a little narrower, a little bit more limited in a pension fund. Oh, and the second question was moving money from so moving them money between the components is not really possible thus far. That's my understanding of it. It's still seen as a single investment, right? So it's almost like the 2 rails of a train. Kind of they're together, but they're apart, and they're going to follow each other all the way along, but they can't necessarily jump from one to the other.
Thank you for that, Gareth. Kwena, your hand is up and I have unmuted or given you access to your mic, so you can unmute and just ask your question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just need to find out, I think I missed it. At retirement, especially on the withdrawals, the first 500 withdrawal, how does it affect your savings account at the end of your retirement if you want to withdraw more money? Or once you reach retirement, you only have the first 500 withdrawal that is untaxed, and then what happens to what's the impact on the savings account?
Yeah. So remember that. So let's take an example. You've got a retirement fund and you're retiring and you've accumulated 9 million in there. You've got 6 million in the retirement component. You've got 3 million in the savings component. You will still be allowed to request all 3 million of the savings component, but it is going to be taxed on the retirement tax table. So the first 550 will be taxed at 0%. The next piece 550 to 770 at 18%. The next piece at 27%, and everything above that 1 million, 1.155 will be done at 36%. So you're still going to apply that. If you have made previous withdrawals, right, you've kind of, or maybe you've drawn out of pension preservation funds or something like that, they're still going to do the usual hypothetical tax calculation and basically do that weighting with previous withdrawals against your current withdrawals to work out the actual tax payable. So as we would now, that's still going to apply. It's just going to be only the savings component of the post 2-pot system that's fully accessible at retirement.
Thank you very much for that answer. Mahlatsi?
Hi, yes, thanks for the opportunity. Just one question with regards to the savings pot. You had mentioned that in quite a few slides that it's actually for emergencies. But I would imagine there isn't necessarily anything holding the client back from simply just taking the funds for what they perceive to be a rainy day. It's not like, I would imagine we're not going to get to a point where an administrator is like, oh, well, we'll need a letter from the bank for this debt you are supposedly trying to close, right?
Currently not. I mean, that would be an ideal situation if there were some guidelines around what would define a financial emergency, but I think also you can't be that prescriptive either. So that's why I mentioned earlier, like for all of us in the room who are going to be advisors, we're going to be out there, we're going to be educating people, helping them to understand that sort of a Black Friday shoe sale is not a financial emergency to draw money out to go and spend necessarily. I work with a couple of pension funds, and we've been talking for like sort of a good 6 to 8 months now with the members at sessions, trying to get people to understand the impact and the danger of making these pre-retirement withdrawals. The sad reality, let's call it, for us right now is that even as the advisor to the company scheme, and even the company itself can be completely bypassed by the member. They can go directly to the fund administrator and request a withdrawal, and the fund administrator right now has to comply with that withdrawal request. So what it means, and I think it's a good point that you kind of touch on there, is there isn't any sort of counseling before that decision is made. It is a little bit of an open checkbook at the moment. So that's why everybody's sort of sweating a little bit about how much is going to happen of these withdrawals because of perceived financial emergencies.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Cool.
Thank you very much. Then there's another hand. Calvin. You just have to unmute yourself, Calvin. Let me just double check that you are allowed a mic. Okay, try again, Calvin. Okay, Calvin seems to be having issues. Nick, you're next in line. You are welcome to raise your question.
Great, thank you, Nikki. Hi, Gareth. Thanks for today's session. I just wanted to ask, just in terms of record keeping regarding these withdrawals that will happen throughout the term of the client's lifetime, do you by any chance know how that's going to be kept? And I mean, if the client or if us or if we will be able to have sight of that at any point in time, just to see if there were previous withdrawals and what the amounts they were and when they took place?
Yeah, look, I think you'll find that the administrator of the fund will have a record keeping duty to keep a record of that. But if you think about it laterally, what's going to happen is these withdrawals are likely going to pop up on people's tax returns as they make them. Because remember, unlike a withdrawal from, say, a preservation fund, because that's taxed explicitly on a withdrawal table and therefore gets its own tax directive, these withdrawals are going to be taxed as PAYE. So they're probably going to have a specific, I would imagine they're going to create a tax code in terms of putting that down as an income and therefore adding it to your taxable income for the year. So, you should have the client, if they've got access to their previous tax returns, I would imagine it's going to show up on there. And then, but if you think about it practically from a planning perspective, it's not really going to have as direct an impact as, in terms of your planning considerations as pension and preservation withdrawals will, because those withdrawals are not actually going to affect your 550 tax-free portion at retirement because they've already been taxed as PAYE. So it's going to be a little easier. The only reason you might need to look at it is from a discussion point of view. But no, I hear you. I mean, the amount of clients that forget that they've drawn R1 million 7 years ago when we asked them,
exactly why
it happens
because
all the time.
It's obviously important. I mean, for, like you say, that conversation that you have with the clients is it's not necessarily going to alter your financial plan for them, but it's also going to give you an idea of the client's behavior over the past couple of years.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think if you look at that, like that example we looked at earlier, if you think about it, if somebody took the straight line, if they've got 3 million rand in their savings, in their retirement component, you would expect them to have like R1 million in their savings component. That would be sort of the logical conclusion you can make from that.
Then thank you for that. I just want to make a comment here, and now I'm going to give my age away. I think we're all going to be in for a surprise, and I hope SARS has got their plans and their ideas together with the pension funds in place by the 1st of September, because I remember when they changed the system from where you were taxed at marginal rate, there was 1,800 Rand, that was years ago, that you could withdraw tax-free, and then they started taxing you on sliding scales, to the withdrawal system where we're now taxed separately on withdrawals and on retirement funds. And that it took SARS probably 5 years to get their act together. But when I started working at FBI, I was still busy fighting SARS on some people's retirement funds that they actually taxed incorrectly those days. So yeah, I think we just need to prepare ourselves that it will probably not be smooth sailing for the first few years until everybody sort of gets into the swing of things. So let's hope SARS has got their act together this time. Yeah. Anyway, Tandu, you're next.
Hello again. Ahmed, I think you've answered the greater part of my question while answering Nick's question. But then now just a comment, So really this new system, I call it three-part system because there are three parts anyway. But then now, so what this actually means is that when the client is making a withdrawal, they actually depleting away the lump sum that they would normally get at retirement that would have that 500,000 rands tax-free portion and then tax on the retirement table. So which means which means it's not, unless like the example you made that with maybe a client that's probably going to open a business with that and make more money. But then ideally it would not really make sense for a client to make withdrawals because they lose it out at the end of the day. Because now when it comes to liquidity and all at retirement, it's possible for them to deplete everything and not have any cash whatsoever, just have the annuitized portion only.
No, 100%. And I think that's where our role and our value as advisors really comes to the fore. Because I think, the analogy I kind of explained to people is that, if you're going to go on a lovely cruise, and you go on this beautiful big boat, you have no intention of sinking, but there's still lifeboats on that boat, so we said it's improving outcomes with a lifeline, and you hope to never ever use that lifeboat or that lifeline or something like that. But if things do go wrong, you're going to be very grateful that it was there. So that's why I say, like, we obviously make the sort of hypothetical assumptions. People get into debt and they need to clear it, and we kind of say tongue in cheek that they're a little bit silly with their savings, but they are like a plethora of genuine financial reasons that people might not have anywhere else to turn to, that yes, as much as it's going to damage the numbers at retirement, there's also no point kind of not being able to live the short term and not even get to retirement one day. So it's just having a balance between those two. I think it's very similar if we engage with a client who's in a situation right now where maybe they're sitting on money in a preservation fund, and then we got to consider, do we draw out of that? Yes, we pay some tax, and yes, we do affect the long-term numbers. But, if we don't address this problem today, we won't even get to the long term.
Thank you for that. Sanette, you're next.
Thanks, Nikki. Thanks, Gareth. If I've got less than 550 in my savings spot when I retire, will the balance of the 550 that hasn't been tax-free then be tax-free on the income?
Yeah, I think my understanding is that. Yeah, my understanding is that will still apply. So none of those rules are changing or going away.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, then Johanna, you're next. You just have to unmute yourself, please. Okay. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay. Because it's kind of like muted on my side. I can't hear you guys. But if you can hear, let me ask. So I wanted to know, so if these people come and they want to start debiting, how much is the minimum that can be requested for withdrawal for them to start taking money out from the savings pot? What is the minimum?
Okay.
And what is the maximum as well?
So currently the minimum is 2,000 Rand. and it is only a one-time withdrawal per tax year. So the minimum is 2,000 before tax and any fees the administrator may charge for whatever reason. In terms of a maximum, again, they haven't put down any maximums. So my understanding is whether you've got, 1,000 Rand or 100,000 Rand in there, you're allowed to request that as a withdrawal subject to tax.
Okay, there's two more hands and one more interesting question that we're going to allow. So Anri and Tatu, I'm going to allow you your questions, but we're running out of time here. Anri, you can go ahead, please.
Hi, thanks, Nikki. Hi, Gareth. So
Hi.
just to Tando's and Sanet's point, and just to get some clarity on the fact. So in essence, let's say a client has drawn their 550,000 Rand or drawn a total of 550,000 Rand and they reach retirement. At the point of retirement, even if they've got money in the savings component, that money will then be taxed according to retirement tables fully because they've used their lifetime tax-free component throughout their working lives.
No. So any withdrawals that they make pre-retirement, so retiring from the fund, is going to be taxed as effectively as income. So it's going to be subject to PAYE. So those withdrawals from the savings component pre-retirement are not going to have an impact on your tax-free lump sum at retirement, that first 550. So remember, if you read the legislation and how that tax table is applied, it uses the word like the first 550 retired from your retirement fund or withdrawn from or received from your retirement fund is taxed at 0%. It doesn't explicitly say lump sum or income.
No, what I mean to say is, they are receiving funds from their retirement annuity on pre-retirement withdrawals. So there's no.
But that's going to be taxed. No. That's going to be taxed as income, as PAYE. So if they are not retiring from the RA, so of course if you are 58 years old and you're still actively employed and you've got this RA that you want to retire from, sure, no problem. You're going to have a vested component that you're going to have the normal sort of 1/3, 2/3 access from, and maybe a little savings pot and a retirement component within there. But the retirement accesses that can still happen at the age of 58. It's still going to be taxed on the retirement tax table. Any annuity that you generate from that is then going to be added to your taxable income once you generate it out of the RA. So that would be like a pre-retirement retirement, but an actual withdrawal where you're accessing the savings component in particular is going to be taxed as income on PAYE tables.
Okay, so bottom line, the 550,000 Rand lifetime tax-free limit remains untouched by pre-retirement withdrawals.
From the savings
component. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
I think it's important from this entire conversation to understand the difference between pre-two-pot savings, the vested savings, and then the rules for the after two-pot has started savings, because that's, I think, where the most of the confusion for both advisors and clients are going to come in, because the rules there is what differs a little bit. Okay, last question. Tatu?
Hi, Nikki. Hi, Gareth. Thank you for the
Hi.
session. I've got two questions, or maybe three. One, what happens to the two pots RA or the new legislation now if the client is now moving abroad? Okay. And then secondly, with the I'm not sure, but it's for the first time I heard of it. I'm a bit behind here. The Provident Fund, I think you said it will no longer be there in the future, right?
Yes.
And then, yeah. So with the Provident Fund, the employer had always almost like being involved in terms of what the member wants to do with their Provident Fund and stuff like that. So firstly, my question is, how much is the maximum contribution of the new RA now, which will be the employer's RA on the Provident Fund? I think it was about 14.5%. And then secondly, the question on that RA is, if the member wants this cash or wants to make a withdrawal, do they still need to go via the employer, or they can go straight to the fund administrators, or it depends on the relationship with the employee-employer? Thank you.
Yeah, so yeah, I can go through those. So the first question there in terms of immigration, look, that is going to still have the 3-year holding period. Although if they do it post two-pot implementation, from a planning perspective, I would expect that the savings component is still fully accessible. So if you emigrate, if you time it properly, maybe you do it and you've stopped working, maybe leave it until the next tax year where you're not actually going to have any income in South Africa. Maybe leave it till that year and then tell them to access the savings component, because it's going to be taxed as PAYE, and obviously they're going to hopefully have no other income as well, so it might reduce the tax liability quite significantly. The retirement component is going to be subject to that 3-year waiting period before you can extract that in cash, because remember, there's a difference there. Obviously, once you've broken tax residency, that will then allow you to kind of tax residency in that 3-year period to request a withdrawal from those funds. The preservation funds would still remain as they are now for an emigration. The other question around the Provident one, that's a completely separate matter. Go and have a look at what happened with T-Day in 2021, where basically the accessibility rules at retirement were changed for Provident funds, which brought them in line with how a pension fund is treated. And then the last question, look, at the moment, in terms of access to the new fund contributions, that's got nothing to do with employer. Remember, that was all harmonized to 27.5% of your taxable income. That doesn't change at all. So across all of your retirement funding products, whether it's a portion of it is in your pension fund at work, maybe you've got an RA on the side, 27.5% is still the maximum tax deductible figure. Obviously, if you're putting in more, it's simply going to roll forward to the next year or until they can actually make a deduction against income. And then lastly, in terms of access, mentioned earlier, unfortunately, you don't currently have to go through your employer or your advisor to access money from your savings component. You can go directly to the fund administrator or the product provider and request a withdrawal. They will simply run it through SARS, get the tax directive, and my understanding is that it will most likely show up as a PAYE taxable income during that tax year.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Just to understand, sorry. So are you saying, let's say I'm not contributing to any other retirement fund or pension fund, but my employers only, can I then contribute on a monthly basis that 27 point whatever percent?
Well, it's collective between yourself and the employer. So it's So remember, they look at your taxable income, 27.5% of that. Remember, contributions to retirement fund. I could put money into your retirement fund, and you could use it as a tax deduction for your 27.5. So whether it's you or your employer doesn't really matter.
Okay. No,
thank you, Tatu. Then, Gareth, do you have another 2 minutes?
Yes, absolutely, Shaima. You've been very patient.
Michael, you've been very patient. You're welcome to ask your question.
Thanks a lot, Nikki. Gareth, just a quick one. So when it's going to be split 1/3, 2/3, is it going to be in the same funds that it is currently now, or is the savings going to be in a different fund than the vested component?
Look, I think initially the answer is no, because as much as we're going to have these two different pots, they're saying still see it as a single investment account or a single investment fund. When they say the two pots, think about it as accessibility. You've got two different rule sets for the money, but ultimately it's basically still sitting over the same fire. But you've got two pots hanging there. And in terms of how it's invested, where it's put, and I think the flexibility, like we mentioned earlier, is going to come down to the platform and the product set. So like an RA is right now, where you can maybe pick and choose a few funds to blend together, or if you're an employer fund, that's where the trustees of that fund is going to get involved. And that's why I say, like, nothing's confirmed just yet, but it's going to have to be one of the considerations in terms of particularly the savings component. What is a reasonable, responsible investment strategy for that piece? Bearing in mind that the intention is that that should be retirement funding money, but the reality is that we need to accept that people will make ad hoc withdrawals from it at random times.
Obviously, accessibility towards the funds is going to be easier if it's a money market, but then your growth is not going to be better. So that's the only thing. I don't know. Are we going to have to say in whether the funds must be, or is it going to be compulsory money market, or what?
Look, I think again, sort of get out of that mindset of being able to allocate the retirement component to one strategy and the savings to another. I think you're gonna have, it's still 100% fund construction, right? Okay. So if you decide to put 10% of the money in a money market, you're going to find that 6.7%, which is the 2/3 that sits in the retirement component, is also going to be lying in money market. So that's why I say we're just going to have to have to be sort of very educational and think about how we do these things. But having said that, like everything, our government cannot be trusted on all things. We still don't have the ratification. We're making a lot of assumptions at the moment. They might kick this can down the road again. They may change some of the stuff, or they may just decide to blindly forge ahead. So we're gonna have to stay flexible.
Okay, excellent. Thanks a lot.
If I can add to that, from a practical perspective, with some of the conversations we've had with fund administrators, it also, even if the options are available to invest the two pots in different investment portfolios and different, risk profiles, it will depend on the sophistication of the fund and the platforms that they use, whether you'll actually be able to do that. And I think Gareth alluded to it earlier. Some of your pension funds will not have the accessibility, especially your umbrella funds that are maybe administered by smaller administrators and. So it also depends on where you're going to invest the money, whether at any point you might be able to do that. So it's really a matter of we'll see how it works when we actually get there at this point in time.
Cool. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
And then the last comment is in the chat, Gareth, GPF, are they also going to be involved in the two-pot system?
Yeah, so simple answer is yes. It's been sort of very explicitly stated that it will apply to all retirement funds. So GPF will need to comply with this. You're going to have a lot of actuaries there working very, very hard, because they're going to have to start doing background calculations, using their modeling system, which is not the easiest to understand necessarily to begin with. It's going to add an extra layer of complexity. So, but to put it simply, they will be subject to two-pot.
Thank you, Gareth. And I'm going to read the comment from Tandu here that says, this is the best explanation of two-pot system, and it only took you a couple of minutes. So thank you so much for your time. Right. Then, as the last comment from the Financial Planning Institute, we have decided from a consumer education viewpoint to ensure that all the people in South Africa that need help on the two-pot system and who's going to be affected by it knows where to go to get the advice that they need. So you keep an eye on our website and on our social media. We are currently making short consumer education videos in all South African languages. And the only thing we're driving is to tell consumers, go see your financial advisor. And if you do not know where to find a financial advisor, go to the FPI's website and go to find a financial planner. And all our designated members that give advice are listed on there. So have a look at that. We want the consumers, or the people who are going to be affected by it, to get advice, and good advice, before they actually make a decision. So that's it from FPI. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Gareth, for your time. It's always lovely to listen to you. And have a wonderful afternoon, everybody.